We're recording? Okay. So this is the second session that we're re-recording since last night. The live version was cut up a bunch by internet interruptions. So here we are. So I wanted to talk a bit more about sourcing bolts, particularly shiitake bolts, and some of the parameters and some of the ways that we see folks sourcing bolts if they're not going to get them from their own woods, whether they are don't have the skills or the materials or infrastructure to harvest efficiently, or don't have the time or don't have the woods themselves. So logs are abundant in rural areas, and there are folks working the woods that are interested potentially in selling bolts. So you don't have to necessarily source your own bolts from a woodlot you have access to if it's not something you want to do. And I would make an argument for those who are getting into commercial production that you want to do the math if you're going to harvest your own bolts and actually consider if it's the best choice for you to do your own harvesting or to buy in some or all of your bolts. Because I found around me and on our farm that time is money, and as the season crunches on and we have lots of things going on, it's sometimes hard to get all the bolts directly from our land, and I can pay somebody $2.50 per 3-foot log, as you see on the truck here, and that's often very, very cost-effective way to acquire these materials. So, with that in mind, let's go through a few slides here. It's hard to say what the demand is. It's going to be very regional, very specific. What we see are individual farms and enterprises partnering with folks who might be interested in providing bolts. We also see folks who do mushroom farming and might cut extra bolts if they have the time to sell. And some folks who cut, inoculate, and then sell the inoculated bolts. So there's lots of opportunities, I guess, in addition to sort of fresh mushrooms production in terms of this enterprise. So we've seen the demand kind of increase over time, people always looking for these. So if you're someone out there who might be wanting to be a provider of bolts, this is for you. If you're someone who might not want to cut all your bolts or source all your bolts yourself, buying them in can be a really viable way to do it. So hard to say, but I wouldn't say the demand is consistent across geography or across time. It's certainly something that's a bit customized or a niche at this point. So we've talked about this a bit, but I think potential customers for logs, they don't have woodlots. We work with folks in New York City who are interested in doing shiitake, and we're currently trying to create some partnerships with folks who do want to bring logs or are willing to bring logs to a central drop-off point, in New York City. You may not have the skill or desire to fell and move logs, or a customer may not have that, and it might be too busy to do it. So whether you're on the receiving end or the providing end, these are things to keep in mind. Regardless, though, and even if you do source all your own bolts, it's really important to keep the quality of those bolts as high as possible. And so we could summarize that by saying that a good bolt, and a bolt is specifically a log that's used for mushroom production, specifically usually shiitake. It's typically small diameter, somewhere between 4 and 8 inches on average, and usually 3 feet long. So you can see the bolts in the front that are kind of oriented left to right to the screen. Those are about 3 feet. And the ones stacked with the ends showing are closer to 6 feet. So when we ordered this lot from our friend who does woods work, he preferred to deliver them in 6-foot lengths, and we agreed we'd cut them up when we were ready to inoculate. So that was easier from his perspective from the management and delivery, and it was fine with us to deal with that. And we just adjusted the price accordingly. So good bolts are freshly cut. They're of the desired species, of course, and they're with minimal damage. And I think that's the biggest one when we talk about sourcing logs or providing, is if you're used to, or if your provider is used to providing logs and wood for, firewood or timber, you don't really care about the quality of the bark. It's fine if it gets scuffed up, and most outfits drag the logs out of the woods. That's not really going to work for mushroom production. The bark is really important for keeping out contaminant fungi as your shiitake or other species get established. And also it's important to maintain moisture in the log. So you have to have a low threshold in terms of the acceptable damage if you're going to buy in logs. And so if someone's willing to get that premium price for the wood, they need to be able to handle these logs in such a way that you don't have damage. So you can see that most of these have pretty good bark on them. So species-wise, what our research at Cornell showed in the early 2000s was that oak, sugar maple, and American beech all performed essentially the same in terms of their productive capacity. We've since experimented with and also heard from other growers that American hornbeam, hot hornbeam, and birch, all these species also do really well with shiitake in particular. And so, it depends on the grower. Some growers don't mind. They'll take any of these. Over time, you might develop a preference. Like on our farm, we can cut a lot of sugar maple from our woods, but we don't have a lot of oak. So if I'm going to buy in logs, I like to buy in species I don't have readily available and get a mix in there, because they all perform a little differently, but they're all really good producers for shiitake in particular. And keep in mind, if you're in another region of the country or the world, we can have conversation about what logs might be most appropriate. These are, sort of northern species, temperate species, North American species. Quercus species, oak species are commonly found in many parts of the world, many different types of climates. We've seen folks inoculate eucalyptus. In the South, sweet gum has been a popular choice for shiitake. So, post in the forum if you're in a different region and don't have these woods available and want some help with that. The timing of the cut is really important. Again, whether you're doing it yourself or sourcing the wood, generally speaking, winter and into spring is good. Once the sap starts flowing in the trees, you really want to pay attention to what we call bark slip, which is where the bark can actually separate a bit from the inner wood as the tree is running sap. Some species do it more than others. I found that red maple and American beech really this can be a problem with, versus oak, which really doesn't seem to have an issue, and oak tends to run sap later anyway. Sugar maple doesn't tend to have slippage of the bark, but it tends to be more vulnerable to damage during the wet sort of sap run part of the season. So, winter's ideal, ground frozen's ideal. That's the best time to work in the woods. You tend to do as little damage as possible. You can, see the tops of the trees, all that. It works great. So ideally, you're cutting in the winter, you're inoculating in the spring. This also works great on the production cycle because you give the logs that full growing season for the mycelium to grow through the log, which we'll get into more next week. So for a commercial operation, ideally you're cutting the winter and then you're inoculating April or May. Now that being said, we did research to show that you could pretty much cut and inoculate any month of the year in a cold climate such as New York State and get success. So it's not a mandatory thing, but it is kind of ideal when we look at all the other factors at play. Really important to not source trees that have a lot of disease. So this is a canker that's from a fungus that is a degenerating fungus on the tree. What the tree does when it gets attacked is it actually walls off this. And so you can see sort of up here as well as below this log, there's actually going to be clean wood if you cut in there. So in this case, this log, you could cut that piece out and probably get some more mushroom bolts that are clean, but you don't want to see stained or dirty or exposed or broken wood like this. This is a sign of disease, and part, if not all, of the tree is not going to be good for mushroom cultivation. Similarly, you might look like a log is good on one side, but you turn it over and you see this exposed, what we call heart rot, inner rot on the wood. Now, technically, the shiitake could still use this sapwood that's persistent here for food source, but I would probably put this in the firewood pile, or I would cut it off below where this is showing and see if I can find nice pure wood, and then I could use the rest of this log. But I would discard this into the firewood pile personally for mushroom production. Similarly, sometimes we see heart rot show up like this. It's not like actually decayed the tree fully or showing on the outside, but we cut through the log. And on a sugar maple, this isn't really a great sign. There's not a lot of sapwood for the mushroom, and so we might discard this again to the firewood pile. So, as you're cutting, as you're working through the logs, it's important to make note of these things and prioritize the quality of the wood, because that's most likely going to translate to better production. And if you're going to put a lot of energy into inoculating and managing these for multiple years, it's worth getting a good start with the best wood possible. And some of that takes, time to really grasp. I recommend if you're going to buy logs, especially if you're going to pay that premium price, that you really emphasize with a provider that you know damage is a no-go for the sale. And actually, when they do their delivery, you need to do an inspection as they unload the logs or as you help unload the logs. And I would accept less than 10% damage personally. So little nicks like this, you can wax over when we get to inoculation. Not the end of the world, but if you have these persistently, or if you have large sections torn or broken off or damaged, it's just not going to be a good mushroom log. So I've found over time it takes a bit of education, and sometimes it takes an awkward conversation for the first load, but you know, it's best to provide your log source with some of the materials we have, with pictures. Really be clear about your expectations so that when they show up with a truckload of busted up logs, that there's not a conflict that ensues. Peter did a great job of linking mushroom log harvesting to forest sustainability, so I won't go into depth with this, but just to emphasize that mushroom log harvesting works really nicely in tandem with forest management for timber, for wildlife, for long-term health. A lot of times we're thinning and doing those intermediate thinning events, and this mushroom production thing gives us an incentive to actually go out there and do that. And oftentimes it's not sort of economically or feasibly logistic for folks to go do this thinning, because of there's not a lot to do with the woods. You know, you can only cut so much firewood if that's of value. So keep in mind that, you know, we want to start with good forest management planning. We want to thin the woods in a way that promotes long-term health, and not just go out into the woods and sort of shop for mushroom logs. Mushrooms don't care. You don't need your best trees. The goal and the role of the mushrooms is actually to decompose this wood as it's thinned out. And as Peter mentioned, you know, we're looking for trees that Mother Nature's already chosen to thin, and those can be our best materials to use for mushrooms. Peter also talked at length about this in the previous video, but just to reemphasize, you know, there's this ongoing question. We don't have the research to show that there's a significant increase in production with a higher sapwood to heartwood ratio. You can see the tree on the left has a lot more sapwood than the tree on the right, which means it's younger, most likely, and it grew at a faster pace. And so if I had a choice between the two, assuming these species were both appropriate for the mushroom I wanted to grow, I would choose the one with a higher ratio. And you can sometimes see the heartwood this obvious, sometimes you can't. So one way you can look at is how wide a gap there is between the rings on the tree. That'll give you some sense of its growth. And so a really fast growing tree will have much more sapwood. It's grown in open light conditions. It's likely going to give you better production. And it can grow as quickly as 0.6 to 0.8 inches a year. If it's less than a quarter inch each ring, then it's a pretty slow growing suppressed tree. So as you're cutting, as you're looking at logs, you know, check those things out, because they can have an impact. And if you have a choice, you know, get a higher sapwood ratio if at all possible. And all that being said, you know, all the research that we've done, the figures we'll talk about for production numbers, this is not something we necessarily accounted for. And so our economic models and our production models, which look very good for mushrooms, are based on kind of a wide range of trees that we just picked out of the woods. Some were suppressed, some were open grown. And so don't sweat over this detail, but if you have the option, you have the opportunity, you know, try to go for that higher sapwood value. So here's an example, just a couple slides talking about, you know, where do logs come from and what is the effect on them. So we thinned out our sugar bush when we first got there and got some mushroom logs, and it was a variety of trees, mostly sugar maples that were suppressed in the understory. Their neighbors were 2, 3, 4 times larger in diameter. They were going to be the trees that at about 50 or 60 years old, which is what this woodlot was, provided us with a really good you know, volume of logs and something to get our operation started. Being that these logs are, you know, about 6 inches in diameter and they're 60 years old, they were rather suppressed. They're not going to have a ton of sapwood, but sugar maple doesn't tend to put a lot of intense heartwood on, so there is still some sap running through the middle of those trees. So I'd say with sugar maple, you know, this is one of those things where, you know, we take what we can get and we stack functions. So we wanted to thin our sugar bush anyway to support the health of the trees that we were going to tap. And so we turned those thinning opportunities into mushroom logs. And they've produced great for us. There's been no issue with them. So, again, connect your activity, connect other larger goals with your mushroom production goals. There's a video in the links this week that talks. It's the ones about the woodlanders, and so one of the videos is about Japanese shiitake production, and it shows some of these coppice systems that Peter talked about in his lecture, where they do these large, kind of small scale clear cuts. They coppice the material. This is their mushroom logs, and these are pretty much 100% heartwood, and they've been grown in open sun conditions, so they're excellent specimens for shiitake. And so this is the standard. This is how mushrooms have often been grown in parts of Asia for centuries. And as Peter mentioned, if you're young, you might want to give a go at some of these coppice regeneration models for producing mushroom logs. Most of us aren't working with this as a natural occurrence in our woods or a phenomenon that's been managed for a long time, and so often lucky enough to come across wood that's grown in this way. But this is really the way it's been done, and if we think about the big picture in the long term, it might be the way we want to head with shiitake. So coppice, what's important to know and key is that you usually cut the tree at the stump in the dormant part of the season. You get those new growth in the following spring and following years, and you thin out those initial sprouts, and you also often thin out multiple times as saplings develop, and you try to really craft the wood that you want. And in this way, you're actually growing the logs, and it's obviously a little easier to harvest the wood at the diameter you want. You also get nice sapwood growth on this kind of system. Challenges with coppice would be getting enough light into the understory to get the good regeneration. So a single tree in the middle of a dense woods is not going to coppice very well, which is why mostly these are done on small clear cuts, maybe 1/10 of an acre, 1/4 of an acre, maybe more. And that they would do this on a 15 to 20 year rotation. And so this area that's cut here will not be cut again for another 15 or 20 years. These are oak trees that are going to take a while to regenerate. Versus you can see up the hill there's a younger stand. That might be the next cutting that they do in a future year. And it really creates a nice mosaic of habitat. And it's been shown that coppice management really provides such an amazing boon to wildlife, because you have a forest that has in all these kind of multiple stages of succession. It's quite remarkable when you look at the science. So as far as pricing bolts, whether you're buying or selling, these are some numbers that our friends at Field and Forest, who did a project in Wisconsin with woodlot owners and mushroom growers to try to match bolts, and they often started with firewood dealers, because firewood folks were interested in providing mushroom logs because they saw the profit potential. So they figured out that in a cord of wood, which is 4 feet wide, 4 feet tall, and 8 feet long, there's about 153 foot bolts. Now they're not, of course, split, and so you don't have to incur that labor cost, but you do have to handle them better, right? Because again, as we talked about, the bark is very important. So we might then think about, well, what does this look like in terms of a per bolt price? So if I was going to go into a site after, let's say, my neighbor had his woods logged and I was going to cut a bunch of tops off the trees, I might say, I'll pay you 50 cents a bolt, because you've done some of the work, you've made it easy for me, but I got to go in there and I got to haul the logs out. If the logger or somebody has the ability to pull the logs out and provide them at a landing by the road, it's a little bit easier. I don't have to traipse through the woods and all that. Maybe I'll pay $1 per bolt. If that person's going to harvest, handle, deliver those logs, usually we see people paying between $2 and $3 per bolt. And then if it's a long 6 foot, 9 foot, 10 foot length, sometimes that happens because someone wants to do a trailer load or a flatbed load, or it might be easier, as I mentioned, for the producer to actually just leave it in a longer length and you cut it up. Sometimes we see folks pricing it per linear foot, and I've seen anywhere from 50 cents to $1 per linear foot. So prices are not fixed, they're always negotiable. If we look at the price per bolt of delivery, this really provides an incentive for folks who might be trying to make a living firewood, because or at least around us, a cord of firewood might go for $200 or so. But if someone's willing to deliver me these bolts, they can make between $300 and $450 a cord. So some of the guys around me that do this on a regular basis have figured this out, and they now call me every year and say, do you want bolts? Because it's such a good price compared to what they get for firewood, and they feel like it's worth the effort to handle them and keep the bark intact. And so now I don't have to train them, and they will drop those bolts off at any point, which is great. Other products, we talk about fresh and dried as the mainstay of a mushroom operation, but just to keep in mind, and we talked about these a little bit before, there's other things you could kind of tack on or expand. And, depending on where you live and what you want to do and your goals, these can be really important or viable parts of the overall enterprise. So cutting logs for people from their land for them. I've done that before, where people want to do mushroom production, but they don't have the skills, and they actually hire me and pay me to cut the logs for them. Or we trade, and I give them a log and I take a log. And so we cut 100 logs, and I give them 50 and I take 50, that sort of thing. We've seen growers in different parts of the country do really well doing cut and inoculated and selling ready to fruit logs, meaning that they actually shepherd them through the first 6 months of the growing. Once that log is ready to fruit, they'll sell it. And you can sell them for sometimes $10 or $20 a piece. Sometimes people sell half logs for that much. They cut that 3-foot log in half, and actually consumers often like that shorter log. So there's lots of ways to play with this, and we'll hear from a guest later in the course about the success they've had cutting and selling ready to fruit logs. And if you sell at farmers markets or holiday markets, this is particularly something to consider that could be potentially profitable. We've had growers offer log inoculation itself at events and charge for that. And that can be successful, it can be fun. We've done for many years. There's a asparagus festival near us, and we set up a log inoculation table. And for a donation of $5 to $10, people can inoculate and take home their own log. And it's a very popular thing. And that money that we make from that usually goes to buy our mushroom spawn for the year, which is a nice trade-off. So we get several $100s from that event, and that goes towards our spawn purchase for the year. We've also seen growers, contract and set up a fruiting yard from a landowner, meaning going to their land, cutting the wood, inoculating it, and setting it up and helping them get started. This starts to get into more of a consulting realm, but as you gain experience, it's something that you could potentially market. And we've seen folks do that and do pretty well. So just to wrap up here, a couple questions that often come up with logs and sourcing. If you're transporting yourself or you're buying logs, how does the regulations around hauling firewood apply to mushroom bolts? So this is a poster from New York State where there's a regulation that you can't move firewood more than 50 miles from its origin. And so, in general, you can't move firewood across state lines. And the purpose of this is to prevent the spread of noxious insects and diseases that might wreak havoc on the woods. And I think it's generally a good principle. The difference is that this is for consumer firewood. This is not something that actually applies, at least in New York State, to mushroom bolt production or to any agricultural crop. And the theory behind that is that if you're invested in something like agricultural production, you're going to pay more attention to the quality of the wood because you don't want wood infested with disease or with an insect, because it's not going to produce good mushrooms or good hop poles for hop production or whatever else you might be using. So the assumption is that if you're using it in that capacity, you are applying some observation and some intelligence, and it's not like you're just Joe Camper who's loading up his truck with firewood and going off to the mountains to camp. You're paying attention and you're interested in not furthering these issues. So that's kind of the stance. And legally speaking, at least in New York State, you can transport mushroom bolts further than 50 miles and you're fine. And if you want to dig deeper, this information is in the Teachable this week. This is the regulation and how it changed initially when they put out the firewood regulation in 2009. It was for every piece of wood, and the lumber products industry as well as the agricultural industry kind of had some backlash. So they revised it in 2012 to clarify the boundaries, and so it's really for firewood and consumer. So, these are the rules in New York State. Generally speaking, it's still not okay to move logs across state lines because states regulate these things on their own. And generally speaking, if you're in a different state or a different part, you want to check with your local regulator and determine how they might classify or what restrictions might be in place. So key things to keep in mind. If there's questions about this, let's talk about it before. New York State does, for firewood, they do require what's called a certificate of origin, which just is documenting logs as they're being moved around. And I don't think this is a bad idea to do in any case for mushroom logs, even if they're not technically regulated. It just provides a paper trail and some traceability if you're buying or selling logs, just so if you do get stopped or questioned, you can provide that and be clear that you're complying with the regulations as stated. And not necessarily every DEC officer, for instance, in New York State is going to know about these nuances. And so it's good to always back up with good traceability measures, with good things there, and to be careful with these things, right? So if there's questions about that, again, hit me up in the forum. One of the things we did years ago is we looked at some of the major pests that were being an issue of concern. We actually presented to some invasive species panels, to some of the regulators, and talked about the fact that for mushroom production, when we look at the major tree species that are being used, and you can see them here, and actually we extended that to other agricultural applications. So we included like black locust, cedar, and tamarack or larch, because those are really commonly used for fence posts or hop poles. When we cross-reference those species with many of the species of concern, we didn't find a lot of issues. So hemlock woolly adelgid, emerald ash borer, these insects are problematic, but they only occupy trees that we're not really interested in using for mushroom production. A couple exceptions might be Asian longhorn beetle, which does have some interest in some of the species, and with oak wilt and sudden oak death can be issues of concern. So just be aware. Generally speaking, we have low risk. It is something to be paying attention to and thinking about. And really, again, it's around the issue of transporting logs. So, buyer, seller, beware about these kind of things. And keep an eye out, right? Source your logs as close to home as possible is really the take-home message if you want to summarize it. And finally, if you're interested in digging, further into this on cornellmushrooms.org, there is a link in the resources for this week. We have a fact sheet that summarizes this presentation. It's something you could share or print out and give to someone who you might be buying logs from. Gives all the parameters, all the kind of basics of species and size and freshness and all these kind of things that we might want to educate folks about if they're interested in providing logs to us. We also have a map that is now for the entire Northeast US, which is we call a log sourcing directory. So anyone who wants to offer logs for sale can apply for this map. We'll put you on there, and then it's a place where folks can go and see if anyone in their area is actually interested in providing bolts. So we started this project off and provided it for New York State, and now we've expanded it further to the Northeast. So check that out if you're interested, if you're trying to find it. If you're interested in providing logs, you can go on and fill out the form and we'll add you to the map. All right, that's all for this video. Comment, question in the forum, and we will talk to you live next week.